Well, hello and welcome to this event. This is a slightly strange way for me to participate in it, somewhat spectral, somewhat ghostly, but I'm very pleased to be able to participate, at least in this strange way. Thanks, first of all, to my old friend Eftihish Pirovalakis and his co-translator Apostolos Lambropoulos for their hard work translating the book, and of course to Nyssos Publications for publishing it. I'm genuinely honored and indeed thrilled to see it appearing in what is, after all, the language of philosophy, Greek. And I'm thrilled that it's judged still to be translatable and publishable after all these years. As some of you may know, I wrote the first draft of my part of the book, my main part of the book, Nderriντά Base, in what I experienced at the time as a feverish few weeks of excitement and discovery in the summer of 1988, half my life ago. So it's really very exciting, and I'm extremely grateful to have it, as it were, relaunched here today. Having said all that, and mentioned the fact that this is an old book in a certain sense of old, I immediately sense in the questions that Eftihish sent me with a view to my preparing this little video, I immediately sense some suspicions or potential reservations on just that point. Here's the first question that he formulated. He says, given the publication date of Derrida, and in light of the fact that from the early 90s onward, Derrida apparently started to reflect more expressly, at least, on issues of an ethical, political, and juridical nature, democracy to come, forgiveness, death penalty, hospitality, the law and unconditional justice, sovereignty, etc. What is today the relevance of Derrida Base, a large portion of which deals with Derrida's early writings on the sign, on writing, the signature, metaphor, etc.? Well, it's true. It's a long time ago, and it deals on what, retrospectively, you might think of as Derrida's early work. Let me say, first of all, that if that's all it did, if that's all that Derrida Base did, was to explicate and exposit reasonably accurately that early work, that would still be something that I could feel fairly comfortable with. I think compared to most other expository work, certainly at the time, I think it gives a clearer sense of those so-called early writings on the sign, writing, signature, metaphor, and so on. And I think these are still difficult and complex issues that some people at least still find quite interesting. And I believe my exposition of those issues is still largely accurate. I certainly don't disown it in any way. And I think it can still help. I like to think anyway that it can still help readers who are struggling with Derrida's difficult thinking in those daunting early texts. So that's the first thing I'd want to say. But of course, I also think I can make a stronger case for what you, Eftichius, call the relevance of Derrida Base, its relevance in view of his subsequent thinking about ethical and political issues. It is true that shortly after, or just around about the same time as the text Circumfession that he wrote for this volume, Derrida did indeed start reflecting more directly, more persistently, more expressly, I think is your word, on these ethical and political issues. And in fact, starting in 1991, that's the date of first publication of the French edition of the book, starting in 1991, his seminar at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales went under the general heading Questions of Responsibility, and that remained its general heading from 1991 until the very last seminar that Derrida taught in 2002 to 2003. So it's indubitable that, in a certain sense at least, Derrida's explicit attention to these ethical and political issues became more prevalent and more obvious in works starting around about the same time as we published the book. But as he himself often said, he'd already, and from the start, been addressing those issues, perhaps not quite so explicitly and persistently. But I'm going to make a fairly maximal claim here, and that's going to be that the real import of that later work, so work from the early 90s until his death, really only becomes clear against the background of what you call the early work, the work that I did indeed spend most of my time talking about in Derrida base. So I want to say that readers who have a grasp of those issues, those early issues, so the issues I try to explicate in Derrida base, I like to think that those readers can approach the later work, some of which is of course still extremely surprising and difficult, but I like to think they can approach that with more confidence than if they did not have any grasp of that background and the earlier work that Derrida also refers to extremely frequently in his later work. He spends quite a lot of time referring back to positions and arguments that he had developed in that earlier work. In fact, I'd just take one example. There's a sentence that I've been thinking about a lot in recent years in Of Grammatology, where Derrida is talking about that difficult, but I think crucial for him, notion of the trace. And he says, I'm not quoting exactly, but he says something like, the thought of the trace gathers together such that it's only possible to separate them by abstraction. The question of temporality, the question of the relation to the other, and the question of language as writing. So this one thought, it's tempting to think Derrida's main or major thought is that thought of the trace, which he then spent the rest of his life trying to figure out in its extreme complexity, gathers, as he says, not only the early work, which seems more concerned perhaps with the phenomenology of time or with questions to do with language and writing, but also the question of the relation to the other in general, which is obviously the opening to all of the ethical and political questions that he more explicitly addresses in that later work. So that just to say that in terms of relevance, I do believe that the work covered in Derrida base is more than relevant and helpful and indeed crucial to understanding the later, more explicitly ethical and political work. But that's spending a lot of time talking about my part of the book, and for many readers, of course, and quite rightly, the main point of the book isn't Derrida base at all. It's Derrida's extraordinary contribution, the text called Circumfession. Because even if, let's face it, even if Derrida base were no longer helpful, even on its own terms, as an attempted explication of some of those early motifs in Derrida's thinking, at least it would have the merit, for which I could still then be quite proud, of having provoked Derrida to write this extraordinary, surprising text called Circumfession. You'll remember, or those of you who know the book at all will remember that the contract between us in agreeing to write the book was that I would attempt to account in an analytic kind of spirit, without quoting him at all. I would attempt to account for the main lines of Derrida's thought, and he, having read that account, would try to write something that escaped it and did not come under the terms of what I'd laid out as a kind of general logic of his thinking. He was supposed to surprise me, and he did. He completely did. This extraordinary text completely took me aback. I had no immediate sense of how to process it. I've still to this day never written about it. I'm not clear to this day that I really understand it. It's, as your second question suggests, eccentric. It's an eccentric text compared to much of Derrida's writing. And maybe it's eccentric to the point that even if, and the contract of the book excluded this, but even if I had been allowed to rewrite my part of the book, I still would not be able to account for it. I do think this is a striking text. I also think, paradoxically enough, it can be read without preparation, without guidance. It can be read almost in a poetic way as a literary kind of text. And at least the provocation for writing this really beautifully written, complex and intricate text, at least that is one of the merits, I think, of the book that we wrote together. Having said that, I'd still say that a careful reader reading Circumfession can find several motifs that still seem of interest, not only to what Derrida base did perhaps manage to explain, but also to some of that more recent work that your first question was referring to. And I'll leave readers the pleasure of discovering Derrida's texts for themselves, but let me just mention one element perhaps, which is a motif that Derrida picks up in St. Augustine. One of the strands of Circumfession is a reading of Augustine's Confessions. And that's the motif that Augustine lays out, whereby in confession, which Derrida also relates to profession, in confession, there's something more at stake than merely speaking the truth. The truth, in a sense, has to be made or done. The truth has to be made in the confession. Gives it a kind of performative dimension, which will again be an irreducible part of Derrida's thinking about all ethical and political issues, even if he goes on to deconstruct the basic terms in which the original thinking of the performative in Austin took place. That dimension, the professing or confessing aspect of a truth that must be made, is an absolutely crucial part of Derrida's later thinking. So I hope that you will enjoy reading Circumfession, at least, which, as I say, is a really extraordinary text. And in a perverse way, I take pride in having provoked it, even though I didn't understand it. And I hope that Derrida base can still help with some of that difficult and intricate early Derrida, which I believe remains relevant until the end. So I hope you have a terrific event today. I hope you enjoy the book, and I'm very pleased and honored to have been able to speak to you. Bye.